Welcome back. My name's Helen Collis. I'm one of the health reporters at Politico Europe. And we are here to discuss on our next panel, Europe's healthcare policy toolbox. Is it nimble and innovative? Before I do, some housekeeping. Please ask questions on the Swap Card app and tweet using the hashtag Politico Healthcare. You can ask questions through the Swap Card platform. You can find the instructions on our website. If you're on a desktop, the screen to the right is where you can ask your questions. If you're on your mobile, you can ask questions just below the live stream. If you're joining us in person, you'll find flyers which can tell you how to do this. Now back to our panel discussion today. So when I first joined Politico 7 years ago, there were rumours that the European Commission was considering divesting some of its DG Santé units among other directorates altogether. While this didn't materialise, fortunately, it was a sign of the limits of Brussels' agency in EU's countries' healthcare systems. Today, however, we're in a very different position. We have the largest EU health budget in the history of the European Union, a new authority, the Health Emergency Preparedness and Response Authority, to prepare and respond to health crises. We have an expanded mandate for the European Medicines Agency and for the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control, and a host of other EU health policy files and programmes in the works. In this panel, we'll explore how Europe's healthcare toolkit has been beefed up due to the pandemic, and we'll look at whether Europe's got the balance right now in being able to intervene in healthcare in member states. Joining me on stage, we have Nicolas González Cesares, a Spanish MEP with the S&D Group. Hello, Nicolas.
Hello, hello.
And joining us online, we have Ima Cook, Executive Director of the European Medicines Agency. Welcome, Ima.
Good morning. Thank you.
And Eva Groot-Arnthal, Vice President, Global Policy for International Developed Markets at Pfizer. Welcome, Eva. Thank you very much, Helen. Ima, I'd like to come to you first, since the Medicines Agency has played such a critical role in the pandemic. It's obviously undergone some huge changes throughout the pandemic to speed up medicines and vaccines development and evaluations and coordinating sufficient supplies of medicines. Can you tell us first, what was it like in the agency when the pandemic first hit and it was clear things had to happen really quickly? Had the agency ever rehearsed for this kind of thing?
So, well, thank you very much for that question, because I think the role that the agency played and continues to play was really based on a lot of prior planning and preparation. We had a health threats plan that we put in place already back in February 2020. And this allowed us to start the process for accelerating discussions with developers, looking at what was coming up, what might be a possibility, providing rapid scientific advice, introducing the concept of rolling reviews. All this was in our health threats plan. Now, what wasn't in our health threats plan was we hadn't anticipated the type of shortages that we would be seeing at the early stages of the pandemic. And this led us to the need for coordination across Europe, led us to put in place an executive group on shortages to really look what was happening on the ground, getting all the member states together, working with the industry, the distributors, trying to understand initially what was happening in China and India, looking at the impact of import bans, lockdowns. So this was something that we hadn't really done before. And I have to say that the work that we did effectively on an informal basis has now translated into our formal mandate. So it was a very intense time for us. I think we had done a lot of preparation, and that really helped us in the beginning. But we also took the initiative to be nimble and agile and really respond to developing needs. So very much near to the ground, adapting while working. It's a crisis. It was we have to find solutions. We have to find solutions that worked in a multi-stakeholder dimension. We had to listen to what was happening on the ground and try and put in place mechanisms that would help in the first instance to manage shortages, and in the second instance to prepare for new vaccines and therapeutics that were much needed at the time.
Thank you. And Eva, I'd like to get your description really and perspective from Pfizer of what it was like in the middle of this, being involved in the clinical response in the middle of the pandemic. Could Europe and the Medicines Agency and the Commission respond quickly enough to what was happening at Pfizer?
I mean, thank you for the question. And obviously, it was an unprecedented time where I would say Europe, including Pfizer, we were all learning as we were doing, because we had never really been in a situation like this before. And it was, as you can imagine, which it would have been for all health authorities as well, a very intense time. But I would like to thank the European Medicines Agency and Mrs. Cook for their flexibility and partnership, for instance, in allowing the rolling view of data that Mrs. Cook just referred to, and for their incredible work during the pandemic, whilst maintaining, obviously, scientific rigor and independence. We saw, I think, a new way of working with compressed timelines and optimized processes, for instance, in the linguistic phase and decision-making phase. And that made a really big difference in getting, in this instance, vaccines faster to the world and to Europe. And I think there are some learnings we can take from that whole period, which hopefully we can apply, to other areas where there's an urgent medical need, like for rare diseases and cancers, and maybe also some other learnings, like increased collaboration on the regulatory dossiers between the European Medicines Agency and other agencies outside of the EU, and another thought is whether or not there is a need for an emergency use authorization process at European level, which we don't have at the moment. But I think it was a time when everybody's kind of under enormous pressure. Also, you see improvement. I think we made quantum leaps in some of the processes that sort of were installed at the time, and I think some of the learnings we can use for the future.
Thanks, Eva. I want to come back on a couple of the points you raised a bit later, but first I'd love to bring Nicholas in, because Nicholas, you were the rapporteur for the file to expand the mandates for the Medicines Agency. What was that like? And obviously you had to work quickly to get that delivered. Were there any major disagreements over extending the mandates, or was it, how did that process happen?
First, let me say thank you for inviting me here, and let me also congratulate Emmer Cook on the EMA, because they made a very good work during this pandemic. So without how fast the European regulatory system could be, and I think these are good news. It was a very hard work, because we're working on this reinforcement of the EMA during the pandemic. So we have to learn all the lessons that we are taking for this crisis, at the same time that we are dealing with a new regulation. And it was one of the main points that I want to mention. It was very hard, but I think that we could set some of these lessons into the regulation of the EMA reinforcement of the Agency for Emergency Situations. And I want to mention one thing that for me was very important to deal with that. Was the necessity of tackle medicine shortage. I think was one of the main issues that was in the main line of the regulation and the discussions. And now we are seeing that we are facing a lot of shortage in Europe with a lot of medicines. And I think that the agency is working on that in better preparedness for shortage, but we need to improve our system. And we need this system for monitoring. We need to go faster in how to monitoring the shortage in the EU, because now it's a big problem. I think that we are seeing how this regulation helped the agency to deal with new threats like the monkeypox, that I think it was a very good response of the agency and also of the HERA authority. But I want to mention, I cannot put at the same level EMA and ECDC with the HERA authority. For me, are not the same. I think that there is a big lack of transparency when it comes to HERA, and I want to mention that here because this is a very specialized forum, and I think this is important for all of you to know that there is a big lack of transparency when it comes to HERA.
We'll touch on HERA a bit later, but I just wanted to put Eva's suggestion to you. What about the emergency use authorizations? Was that something that could have been included in this extended mandate? And if not, why not?
I think that this was not the scope of the reinforcement of the EMA for this emergency. But I think this is something that will be defined in the next revision, and defined or discussed in the next revision of the pharmaceutical legislation that is close to come to the Parliament. We are waiting for that for a long time. So this is the real issue.
Yes, you and I both. EMA, coming back to you, the emergency use authorization, is that something that the agency would like to have as one of its tools in a future threat?
Yeah, so I think it's always good for us to have multiple tools at our disposal. I think that would be my first message. But I have to say that the conditional marketing authorization really served us well during the current pandemic. And you have to understand that we are serving 500 million citizens in the EU, 27 member states. And, you know, this is not an easy task, and this needs a consistent and legally solid approach. I do think the conditional marketing authorization was the right approach for vaccine authorization, because it meant that we could assure the 500 million citizens that we were basing our assessment on the full efficacy, quality and safety that we would require for an authorization. So a conditional marketing authorization is an authorization. The only difference is that there are actually legal obligations on the companies to provide some additional data after the authorization instead of upfront, which would have had an effect on access. So, but in terms of the possibility of emergency use authorization in some restricted situations, I think this is something that it would be good to consider as part of the toolbox. And maybe this is something where the pharmaceutical legislation could look at in the new proposals that are being put forward.
Fantastic. Well, I will make note of that and look out for it. Staying with you, Emma, Nicholas mentioned there's a real need, an urgent crisis now with medicines shortages. Can you update us on your work plan to develop this sort of program to monitor drug shortages? I saw the Commission put out a work program last week on how it's planning a pilot to really look at the 53,000 products that are in use across Europe and come up with lists of those which are really most at risk.
Yes. So first of all, I really want to use this opportunity to thank Mr. Casares for his leadership and work in terms of the extended mandate. And I know the issue of shortages was very close to his heart as he was bringing all the different voices together in what effectively ended up as our extended mandate. And just to highlight that we have a number of formal roles now that we didn't have before that allow us to act on shortages in public health emergency settings and in the context of major events. And I would also refer to the European Shortages Monitoring Platform, which is an important tool to have visibility and transparency of where the products are across Europe. And this is all really thanks to the leadership of Mr. Casares as rapporteur for the extended mandate. So just to point out a couple of things that we are doing and can do. We have a medicines shortages steering group, an executive group of effectively heads of agencies, but also involving patient representatives. We also involve HERA and ECDC as necessary. Where at the moment we're focusing really on the shortages during public health emergencies and major events, but it does give us a tool to put additional requirements on companies, on additional requirements for transparency, so that we can really act proactively to mitigate shortages. So we've been, since the mandate came into force, we've been meeting regularly. We've set up the single point of contact working groups. These are working groups, these are separate working groups at the authority level and at the industry level. And this gives us real-time information on what's happening on the ground and whether there is a need to take a strategic decision to address any upcoming or planned shortages. And just to give you an example, 3 examples of what the MSSG has done since it was officially inaugurated effectively in March of this year. We have reacted to the monkeypox public health emergency of international concern, identifying in very short time the critical medicines that needed monitoring and information on supply and demand, and that's of course Tezovirimat, the antiviral, and Imvanex, the vaccine. So that shows the translation of the new powers into action. The other area that one of the other products that we're looking at now is actually a thrombolytic, where we see there are ongoing shortages, and this really could have a major impact on the treatment of certain cardiac diseases. So we're working not only with the company has come to present to the MSSG, but also with international regulators and other suppliers to see if we can put a plan in place. So that's all already happening. And then the third area where I think we have a major responsibility to do all we can is in the context of potential impacts of the gas and energy crisis, where we need to understand what the impact on medicines will be and what part we can play in preventing shortages. And the new mandate gives us the power to do that.
Very interesting and important point you've raised there, which we hopefully will get a chance to touch on again in a little bit. But Eva, I just wanted to get your perspective on the sort of expanded roles of the European Union in health crises, one of which is the formation of the Health Emergency and Response Authority, which is one of its roles is to work with industry to jointly procure medical countermeasures in a health crisis. From industry's perspective, does having HERA make it easier to work with Brussels in that kind of situation?
Well, first of all, I want to acknowledge your comments your introductory comments that it's true. Years ago, we were discussing should there even be a DG Health at the European level, and then I think with the pandemic, I mean, we moved into a completely different gear, and obviously. Europe as an entity was keen, and the European Commission was keen to demonstrate value at the time of when the pandemic broke out. And I think that COVID-19 really showed that coordinated action at European level is necessary to effectively respond to an EU-wide health emergency like COVID or something else, whatever they may be. So. HERA is a fairly new entity. We have it's only a year, I think, since they were created. And so obviously, experiences are fairly limited, but we support the sort of end-to-end approach from threat assessment to an intelligence gathering to promoting advanced R&D, and also ensure that, the measures, whether it's for monkeypox or for vaccine or for the pandemic are available. So I think this was something industry largely felt was needed. But obviously, it's still early days. And I think in order to really fulfill the ambition of that agency, it needs to have adequate resources and budget and an autonomy. And again, I think our experience with HERA has only been since, the last 6 months or so, since the creation. So I think there's still, the jury is still out, but by and large, I'd say we're very supportive of having this procurement agency, in place, and to both work in, as they say, in peacetime and in a pandemic setting.
Thank you, Eva. And Nicholas, I know you wanted to talk about HERA, and here's your opportunity. So, what are your thoughts on what Eva said? It needs to have the right resources, budget, autonomy. Does it have those things? Is it fit for purpose for dealing with the next health crisis? And preparing for the future ones.
First, let me say one thing. I think that HERA is a very good idea to better preparedness for new emergency threats, for the threats that we are having now and probably in the future, to be agile in the response. But I think the way that the HERA was organizing, I think is a bad idea. The HERA is a very good thing to this emergency response. We can see that the new measures in the monkeypox, okay, I agree that it was very, very fast. And also they were very fast with the reaction of the nuclear threat from the invasion of Russia against Ukraine and the joint procurement of protection equipment for nuclear threats. I think it was a good reaction. But let me be clear. Emmer could mention before that the legislative process of the standing mandate of the EMA worked properly. Co-legislators, Council and Parliament made an agreement, and we have an standing mandate for EMA. We have also for ECDC, and we have the cross-border. So the Union Health that was presented for the Commission is working. So the Parliament and co-legislators were perfectly working on these files. Why HERA is trying to avoid Parliament? Why HERA has this lack of transparency? And for me, this is a real problem for future, because we are seeing right now these problems. I can agree that, for example, the people from Pfizer can be very happy with HERA, but the Parliament is not very happy what is happening with HERA and the contracts of vaccines. And I want to mention this here, because we have a COVID committee, and a special COVID committee, and we have seen in previous days this lack of transparency. We don't know anything about the contracts of the vaccines. The real matters, the pricing, this is not clear right now. And we have a European Public Prosecutor Office that has this process under scrutiny. So for future, I think that we need more transparency and we need a regulation for HERA. We need this regulation for HERA. And it's not a problem or it's not the fault of Pfizer. I'm not saying that. The fault is from the Commission. They have to present a new regulation for the functioning of HERA, like they did in the past with ECDC, with EMA, and of course with the Health Threats Cross-Border Directive.
Mm-hmm. Well, we don't have someone from the European Commission with us in this panel, but seeing as you're talking about vaccine contracts, Eva, would you like to come back on that discussion there from Nicholas on criticisms of the opacity of the vaccine contracts?
I mean, it's something that has been discussed, in various, and I'm well aware, of course, in the recent COVID committee hearing in the European Parliament. I mean, the contract was between the manufacturers and the European Commission. Again, I'm also aware of the investigation into the from the European Public Prosecutor's Office, and we'll see what comes out of that. And of course, there's the Court of Auditors report that has also looked into the whole procurement process in the pandemic phase. And again, I'm sure we can take learnings from everything that's been going on. As I said at the beginning of my comments, things were happening at a very, very rapid pace. We almost seem to forget now that 2.5 years ago we were at the beginning of a pandemic nobody had ever heard about, COVID-19, let alone having any vaccines on the market. So it was really a race to get vaccines to the people of the world, essentially. So I think I think it's appropriate to do some retrospection and consider where things can be done better. And Mr. Cesar has made some points. Again, this was a very unique situation. So let's see where we come out.
Thank you. I'd like to quickly turn to how we can develop the right drugs and vaccines in the next health crisis. Emma, how can we ensure that we're testing the right medical interventions in the right people without duplicating and wasting efforts on small studies? Does EMA have a mandate to go far enough to ensure that the clinical trials that happen next time have a lot of collaboration across the EU?
Yeah, thank you very much, Helen. And I think this is, again, one of our learnings from the 2.5 years ago, as Eva says. We forget a lot of things that happened at that time, and there was such a race for also for products and possible solutions that, in fact, a lot of the trials that were being done didn't lead to statistically significant outputs that we could use for regulatory purposes. Now, of course, that all changed with the vaccines because we had such a large population of subjects in the vaccine trials. But in the therapeutic area, the number of participants tended to be very small, which meant that there was not, we couldn't use the outcomes of these as effectively as we might have. So that's definitely something that we need to do better in the future. So I would say, one, ensuring that the trials that are done can be used for regulatory purposes. I think that's very important. So we can enable, we can make sure that the subjects that are contributing really contribute to new solutions. And that does require more coordinating. And maybe if I could just say a word about the accelerating clinical trials in the EU initiative that the EMA, the European Commission, and the Heads of Medicines Agency has launched together, because this is born this is born of trying to do things better in the clinical trial space. Enabling, the theme of this session is about nimbleness, being more nimble in this space, so that we can enable things like decentralized trials, meaning that patients don't have to go to individual, to central sites to participate in clinical trials. That's a huge benefit for rare diseases, for people with debilitating circumstances. So there's lots of opportunities to do things better, and that's an opportunity that we're taking, and not completely born from the pandemic, but some of the lessons that we've learned from the pandemic are going to feed in here. And the other thing just to mention, because Eva also mentioned international collaboration, I chair the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities, and we have a group looking at clinical trials in emergency situations. Can we enable more platform type trials? Can we have protocols ready to go so that we don't have to use the time to find agreement on a protocol when the next crisis hits?
Thank you. We just have time for a few questions from the audience here. Here's a question from Enrico Lacovici. Does the EU toolbox still miss tools to protect immunocompromised patients? Vaccine strategy, therapeutic strategy, the communication on sustained response to COVID-19 barely mentions this subpopulation, but they are the most at risk. Nicholas, do you want to respond to that?
I don't understand the question.
Do we have the tools in the EU to protect immunocompromised patients in a health crisis?
Okay, I think we are better than in the past. I think we have learned a lot of lessons in this pandemic. We set new regulations. We dedicated funds for this. I think we are better prepared right now. But who knows? Who knows is going to be the next threat for minorities, which is the next threat. I think this is the real issue. I am emergency nurse, and I learned one thing when I was emergency nurse. The next emergency is not that the previous one. It's not like that the previous one. Could be completely different. And this is one thing that we need to know. And that's what I mentioned, that HERA should be regulated, because we need to be agile, but we need safety, public transparency, and of course, scrutiny from the parliament or from the different organizations. And let me be clear, finally, one thing that I want to mention. I can understand that the urgency during the pandemic, but now we are not in the same stage. And if we are spending public money, we have to say to the people how this money is spent. For me, this is very important. I am a member of the parliament, sorry for that. But the scrutiny is one of my duties, and I have to do it.
Thank you, Nicholas. That brings us to the end of our time this morning. So thank you very much to our speakers, Nicholas, Emma, and Eva. I think to sum up, I think we are certainly in a very different position in Europe today than we were before the pandemic to deal with another health threat. The medicines regulator can switch to a new mode of offering rolling reviews and quicker regulatory assessments and scientific advice, and can monitor now drug shortages, as we've seen with monkeypox, the vaccine there. There seems to be agreement that HERA is a good thing for Europe, but the jury's still out on whether or not it's going to be fit for purpose longer term. Thank you very much for joining us online and in the room here. We now have a 30-minute break, and after that we'll be back to interview Heike Prins from Bayer, followed by a panel discussion on the pharmaceutical strategy. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.